Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. My name is Greg Brail. I'm a software engineer at Google. I've been part of the team that works on the Apigee API management platform for about 12 years. Been at Google a little more than 2 years. I'll be joined later by Keith Danekind, who works in our field, and is going to help me with some demos. And the main thing we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about APIs. We're going to talk about things that companies have done with APIs. We're going to show some examples of that. We're going to talk about the business for about 10 minutes. Then we're going to get into a little bit about what API management technology looks like and what people are able to do with it. So there's our agenda, but better than look at the agenda slide, let's just get started. So these are examples of companies who have had real business results by using APIs, either by creating API programs that are used by third parties, by creating new digital experiences with APIs, or by essentially taking advantage of the ability to use an API as a layer on top of legacy technology. For instance, Starbucks has a mobile app that people use for buying coffee, and they also have some interesting digital wallet capabilities. That app runs on an API that is layered on top of Starbucks' legacy technology. I'll get better as this goes on. Similarly, a company called Arity is actually in the business-to-business business, and what they've been able to use is by having an API program rather than sort of the old-fashioned way of getting partners signed up that takes months and months to have conversations and emails and PowerPoints and things. By having a self-service API, their partners can get onboarded in just a few days or even a few hours. This is an example of some of the ways the customers have been taking advantage of this API technology that we all know from the internet, applying it to their businesses and getting some real results. APIs and API management have been around for a while. We've been talking about it for a long time. The term API, of course, is 40 years old. I'm really talking here about web APIs, the kind of APIs that run on the internet, the kind of APIs you use when you interface with Google Cloud or with third-party services like Twitter or even Facebook. Most companies that start out with APIs kind of start out on the lower left here. They need to solve some integration problems. I need to connect a new technology platform to an old technology platform. I want to make it easy to build something like a mobile app. And sort of on the two boxes on the lower left-hand corner, this is what people were doing 6 or 7 years ago. They were doing things like putting an API layer in front of a legacy app so that mobile developers could use technology they understood, like JSON and HTTP, to build a new experience for their existing legacy technology. But what started to happen is, for one, just having a mobile app wasn't enough. Now we have things like connected devices and smart speakers and connected cars and talking refrigerators and things like that. And all of those kinds of things require some sort of API behind them. When you say, OK, Google, buy me tickets for the Lady Gaga concert, that's only possible if the company that's selling those tickets actually has some sort of API for Google Home to speak to. So, fancy marketing term, but instead of talking about building apps, now we talk about creating digital experiences. But the companies that have really done interesting things with APIs have used APIs to create new business models and create marketplaces and platforms. And I'll talk about some examples. One great example we have is Magalu, formerly known as Magazine Luiza. It's the largest retailer in Brazil. They'll be speaking later at the conference. We'll put up a list of some of the sessions later on. Magalu is a brick-and-mortar retailer with stores all over Brazil. And a couple of years ago, they began transforming their business by changing from a traditional retailer to one that has very strong capabilities around the web and around mobile apps. But in recent years, they've gone even farther. Now they have a platform. So third-party sellers, logistics providers, all kinds of people can both put products in their stores, take advantage of their network of stores and their distribution capabilities to sell their products, as well as build other ways to integrate with their infrastructure. Essentially, this kind of makes Magalu the Amazon of Brazil, which is funny because Brazil already has an Amazon, but it's something that's actually given them huge business results and actually huge results in their stock price as well. Another great example is AccuWeather, also speaking here at the conference. AccuWeather, we all know AccuWeather in the United States as being, the person who the weatherman on television gets information from. But that weather person on television is only part of what they do. They also have an API that gets 40 to 50 billion API calls a day from all sorts of digital devices and connected devices that want to show you the weather. But the interesting thing is that their business is actually much more than that. There are businesses such as insurance and financial financial services, risk management, reinsurance, all kind of businesses like that, that the weather events have a big impact on their business. So AccuWeather is able to sell more valuable, basically more expensive forecast products tailored to those industries. And the fact that if they can have an API platform that allows people to sign up and get those products via self-service, by clicking a button on a website, signing up for an API, paying some money and using that API, they can get customers to use those systems much more quickly than they might have in the past. Last example I'll give you is Ticketmaster. In the United States, we know Ticketmaster is one of the companies you go to buy tickets. But an interesting stat is that at least 10% of the traffic of the numbers of tickets that are sold on Ticketmaster are not sold directly from Ticketmaster's website or their mobile app, but from third parties. For instance, there are hotels who, when you make your hotel reservation, they say, hey, you'll be in New York next week, how about tickets to Frozen? These kinds of things actually happen using an API, and again, it's a great example of a company like Ticketmaster using APIs to allow third parties to drive new businesses on top of their platform. The reason why this kind of thing can work is that these companies treat APIs not as a bit of technology or about, hey, isn't it cool that I can send you JSON and get tickets to Frozen, but actually that they think about their APIs as products that they sell to a customer. They have to think about who the customer is for their API. So Magalu has to think about, if I'm going to offer an API for third-party vendors to sell stuff in my network of stores, what kind of technologies do those vendors have? What are they going to have to do in order to actually get on my platform? What can I do to reduce the friction? And how do I keep track of that so it actually affects my business? Similarly, AccuWeather has to think about, if people are going to build mobile apps or other kind of digital experiences on my services, what kind of technology do I have to offer? What kind of APIs do you have to offer? In other words, these companies that have done successful things in their business with APIs have done it because they treat their APIs as products. They have product managers. The product managers look at who the customer segmentation is. They look at analytics and statistics to see which APIs are most popular. And they introduce new APIs and new API capabilities, not based on what would be cool, but based on what's actually done by what actually the numbers they're seeing. They have a way of becoming data-driven. And this is something that any company that does product management knows how to do. But a lot of companies that are entering into the API world from sort of an enterprise integration perspective aren't used to thinking that way. They're thinking about, I need to solve a business problem, I need to solve a technology problem, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? But the companies that are successful with API are thinking, we have customers out there. Our customers are hotel chains who want to build integrations with Ticketmaster's ticketing API. What kind of technology platform do they have? What features are they looking for? How do I engage with those customers and make it easy to sign up? And these companies essentially they're in the same sort of enterprise sales business that Google Cloud is in, with managing relationships with customers and treating those APIs just the way we treat any other product. So that's about all I'm going to say about the high level of APIs and API management. What we're now going to do is Keith is going to show us a little bit about what it looks like to be a consumer of an API. And if we could switch to the demo. Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Greg. So we heard a little bit about what these customers are doing when they want to produce APIs, share them with the world. What does it look like when you want to consume one of these APIs? So let's imagine you're an application developer and you'd like to write an application. So I wanted to write an application that would look at historical weather. I started thinking about weather in different places and things like that, and I thought it would be nice to be able to go back and look at historical weather. So the application I've written here, you can come in and you can put in a location. In this case, I've typed in San Francisco. When I hit this Find button up here, it will find weather stations that are near that location. And for each of those, I can select one, and then I can go back and look at the weather history. So I'm looking at San Francisco downtown. I've gone back to 1930, and it's pulled down a year of weather for me. The red line is the high temperature in Fahrenheit, blue line low temperature, and January on the left and December on the right. So nice application, very easy to write. How do they do this? So as an application developer, really what I'm focused on is the user experience, and I just want the data from somewhere, and I don't want to have to go through a lot of trouble to get it. So I found this data out on this web page. So this is an example of a developer portal. What I'm seeing here is this company's developer experience. So as an application developer, I'm going to come out here, and I'm going to start reading about what APIs are available, what can I do with them, and things like that. So as I come into here, I'm going to look at, looks like there's some API products and some things to get me started. Looks like there's some sample code in here that might help me be able to use these things. I'm going to come down and look at, let's try this weather history, try it out. Provides 100 calls per day for a developer. Looks great. So as I come into here, I'm going to find that I've got a whole list of APIs in here. I've got one that will look up particular weather stations, and I've got one that will get me temperature data or wind data. The first one I want to try is this weather station thing, and they have a nice little try it out over here and some documentation. So I would read through this, and if we're thinking like a developer, the goal is, okay, how do I get data from this as quickly as possible? What kind of things do I need to do? How do I get authenticated? How do I call this? So for this, it looks like there is an API key required, and then we're going to provide some sort of street address or place. So let's go up and register. I'm already logged in here. I'm going to register an application, and that gives me an API key. Let's call this Next Demo. Okay, and we're going to go with this try it out here. And then I'm going to come up here and hit create. And that's registered my application. So once my application is registered, I've been given credentials that I can try for this. I've got a key and a secret. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to cut and paste that key. Next thing I want to do is I'm going to go back to my APIs and I'm going to try this out. So now that I have my key, let's go into here and let's try San Francisco again. And that's going to pull down some weather stations that are near me.
And it's a demo. Okay.
There they are. Okay,
okay,
so I've got back a series of weather stations. So there's the latitude and longitude that matched San Francisco. It went out to Google Maps, it found that latitude and longitude, brought it back, and then it's searching for weather stations that are near that point. And it looks like there's a few in there. And there they are. So I'm going to grab this first one here. And then we're going to go over to here. And it looks like we can get temperature and wind data for that particular weather station. So let's look up historical temperature data. Let me grab an API key. And let's go back a few years. Let's go back to, let's say, 1950. And it's a demo. Okay, we'll go back to our key. Let's try this one.
By the way, we will be deleting all these API keys when
Thanks, Greg.
because this is going to be on YouTube.
Okay, now it works. My API key was a little bit stale there. So I've got weather data back for this particular weather station that year, and then there's a whole array of 365 days of weather data. So that was pretty easy to do. I could take that and I could build an application from it.
So now we've impersonated an API consumer.
Yes.
Now we're going to go behind the curtains a little bit and impersonate an API product manager.
Yes.
Basically, how would you, as a company that wants to offer such an API, make the sign-on experience for your customers as easy as what Keith just showed? And how do you actually, as a product manager, what do you do? How do you actually keep track of who's using your API?
Right. So I've configured some things in here to productize these APIs. I want to think about, I've got a set of services, but how do I turn those into a package that I can share? I have different people who want to consume them, and I might want to package them different ways because different people have different rights to these. Let's imagine I've got a bunch of partners. Some of them are allowed to do some things, others are allowed to do other things. And I want to control how frequently they can call this. I want to place some rate limits on there and things like that. So I've packaged these up into these products that we see here. What I'm really concerned about daily, though, is what do the analytics look like? Who's calling them? What are they doing? How can I improve my API program? So for that, I'm going to come in and we're going to look at a few different reports in here. So I'm now playing the role of an API manager. And what I might do on a daily basis is come in and look at some of these reports. So what I'm seeing here is my proxy performance. And I can see traffic rolling into here, and I get an idea of the most basic metric here. How many people are calling this thing and what are they doing? So there's traffic, average response time, traffic by proxy, average response time by proxy. Another thing I might be interested in is looking at, let me restart these so my demo's better. Okay. Another thing I might want to look at is developer engagement. And that's going to show me who's called here. So how many people have called this, what have they done, and that sort of thing. Let's jump ahead to one that's loaded. So another thing that's really important, let's look at devices. So I want to know who's on iOS, who's on Windows, who's on Android, that sort of thing. This might influence how I'm going to build my, my mobile apps and things like that. So this report's going to show me who's coming in and what they're doing and how much traffic I have by device. I may come in and want to look at a map, and the map would show me where all my traffic's coming from. And I can zoom in and I can look at a particular location and get an idea of who's calling from where. So I've got some traffic coming from California, not unexpected. But I can get an idea of where people are calling from, the latency from those different locations, and things like that. I might want to create a custom report. And in this custom report, I'm going to look at traffic by weather station. So maybe I have a curiosity just to know where are people searching for these weather stations, which ones are interesting, and what are they pulling up. So there's a number of metrics that are provided for me, and I've also collected a custom metric that I grabbed out of the request, and that was the particular weather station that they're looking for. And that's what's shown on this report. So that's a quick tour of what I might do as an API product manager when I look through all these different analytics.
Cool, thanks. So we've talked a little bit, and we can go back to the slides now. We've talked a little bit about what it would look like to be the consumer of an API. Basically, what we saw was, gee, it was really easy to sign up, to get a key, to get credentials, and to start calling that API. We also looked a little bit at what it would look like to be an API product manager. If I'm an API product manager, what do I do? How do I actually manage the people who are using my API? And that's really important because the companies that have succeeded with APIs have treated them as products and really taken that product management discipline to heart. We're going to get back to some of the technology later, but we're going to move on a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the high-level technologies you need to understand in order to run a successful API program. What are some specific things that make APIs and API management sort of a different kind of technology than other things that are out there? Well, the first thing is what I've been calling a lot API consumer management, but it's really API management. API management is a set of technology that manages the relationship between the consumers of an API and the producers of an API. And it's really the only bit of technology in the enterprise that does that. It's extremely important for these kinds of use cases we've been talking about, because it's the only way for an API product manager to understand who is using their API, how much are they using their API, and allows them to create products that actually comprise the APIs and allow you to have different offerings. So in Keith's demo, there was a free developer version of the weather app that you could call 100 times a day. And presumably, if we had clicked farther, maybe if he wanted to launch an app on the App Store and have 100 million API calls a day on that same API, he would probably have some way on that form to speak to the API product manager directly and negotiate terms of service or prices or whatever. Sophisticated companies, and companies that have large numbers of APIs inside their companies, use the API management product not only to manage relationships with external partners, but also internally. If you want to be able to, say, offer an API within a large financial services organization and let anybody in the organization use your API, you need a way for them to sign up, get credentials. You may have APIs that you want to make visible only to certain teams. You may eventually want to make those APIs visible externally, and you may want to have certain partners who have access to certain APIs and certain partners that don't. Many companies that have been running APIs for many years in production need these kind of capabilities, and rather than build a lot of these things ad hoc and from scratch, as some companies do, products, API management products actually exist that basically give you a way to manage all this stuff. So when I talk about APIs and API management, I spend a lot of time on this, because to me, this is what API management is. It's technology to manage that relationship between producers and consumers. But there are other parts to API management as well that are really important, and that in order to run a successful API, it's important to understand. One of them is OAuth. OAuth is the de facto standard for access control for mobile applications and really any kind of applications, and it's even used via single sign-on via web apps. If you're using an app that uses a Google API, you're using OAuth. If you're using a website that uses these APIs, or if you're signing into Twitter, or if you're at work and you clicked on your internal link that signs you into your health insurance account and the web browser redirects 47 times, that's also OAuth. OAuth has become this de facto standard, and also it's a set of IETF standards because it makes possible to decouple the different parts of the identity relationship. It allows the API gateway, which is usually a proxy that's sitting in between the clients and the backends, to actually look at access tokens and decide whether an API call should be accepted or rejected. And it allows that API gateway to be separate from the identity system that actually signs in the user. So that's why when you see websites that have sign in via Google, sign in via Facebook, or sign in via GitHub, all of that is done using OAuth. And people build open APIs and mobile applications using that same technology. And an interesting thing about OAuth is that each OAuth token, which is the thing that your mobile device actually sends when it makes an API call to identify you, not only is unique, so it identifies a certain device, it identifies the user who signed in using the IDP in order to get the token, but it also identifies the application that made the request. So the reason why OAuth is so important to API management is going back to this slide here, because each OAuth token identifies the consumer of the API, exactly what application built the API. This can be really important. We've seen cases, for instance, where a customer launches an API and they have a problem in production because a new version of a client application has gone out of control due for any kind of numbers and is sending thousands of requests a second to the API from phones all over the world. Well, without understanding exactly which application is making that request, there's not much you can do about it. But if you have an API management system in, or it's wired up to your OAuth, you might be able to say, take all the requests from this application and black hole them to another server, or even reject them entirely at the API gateway layer so they don't bring down the rest of my infrastructure. Two other really important bits of API management. One of them are quotas. Quotas are something we see in every API today. Those of you who are Google Cloud customers, and we hope you will all be Google Cloud customers, are probably frustrated with the fact that quotas exist, but they're essential for any company that offers a platform. Google has quotas on its cloud APIs to prevent, for instance, someone putting their credentials in GitHub and getting picked up there and used to spin 100,000 virtual machines for Bitcoin mining. I would say that never happens, but it totally happens. Similarly, we have quotas to protect us against those sorts of things. Anyone who has an API in production, you need quotas if you're going to let people sign up for your API for self-service. Why do you want to do that? You want to do that because that self-service that we saw, any developer can click a button and use an API within 5 minutes. It only works if you have some way to control the amount of traffic coming into your API so that a new user doesn't overwhelm your capacity. And you can't do that unless you have a quota and unless you have an API management system that can let you control which application is using your API and by how much. Good quota systems let you set all kinds of quotas and also let you do things like reset them, have different levels of service for different customers and change them. So for instance, if you actually do need 100,000 VMs on Google Cloud, there's a way that you can ask a Google support person to increase your quota because now we know who you are, we trust you, and we know you're not doing Bitcoin mining. So these are the kinds of things that become really important when you run APIs at scale. Security threats are a big deal, of course. OAuth is a big part of security, but API gateways are very important for security, but they operate at the highest level. They're able to tell you if an API call has a legitimate access token or it comes from a legitimate application. But there are other kinds of security threats as well. For instance, let's imagine that Keith had amended his API to let you send in, using some sort of JSON payload, what the weather is now. Hey, you know, it's actually raining in San Francisco. Your app told me it was sunny. Well, a whole lot of things could go wrong with that, right? To start with, the description of the weather might not be something that they want to publish, but that's a different problem. But yeah, you're accepting JSON from untrusted people on the internet. So what's to stop someone from sending you a 100 megabyte comment. Not that JSON has comments, but a 100 megabyte string, or something that's less than 10,000 levels deep. Or instead of your weather station ID, they put in, semicolon, delete star from customers or something like that. All of these kinds of threats are real and can happen when you're accepting data like JSON or XML or something else from an untrusted party, and it's really important to be able to protect against those things, so a lot of API gateways can do that as well. I'll also mention DDoS. A lot of people say, oh, I need an API gateway to protect me from DDoS attacks. The truth is that API gateway technology is essential for these kinds of things because of quotas, because of authentication, but that's got to be a fully multi-layered approach. So that's why we have DDoS protection built into Google Cloud. We have additional products like Cloud Armor that give you more sophisticated DDoS protection, but there are many layers necessary in any kind of internet-facing product to protect against those. Finally, I'll mention one part of API management that's not really as tightly connected to the others, but it's something that becomes very important in the real world, which is mediation and transformation and integration. Many of the examples I used at the beginning of this presentation were companies that created new digital experiences on top of legacy systems, because almost everybody out there in the world has legacy systems. Well, those legacy systems usually don't present the kind of API that, for instance, the Google Home device expects, or that a mobile application developer is using. They may return 25K of XML when what a mobile app really needs is 200 bytes of JSON. They may not have been designed for the internet era and may not even contemplate being used by hundreds of thousands or millions of people. Their response time may be low. So it can be very, very important to be able to use something like an API gateway to mediate and transform different technologies so you can take that SOAP application that's been in production for 15 years, build an API on it, and then be able to use it to launch a new digital experience. This even goes sort of in the forward direction. Developers who are building things with microservices today love to use technology like gRPC. It's efficient, it's easily integrated with certain programming languages, it's easier to develop depending on the context, but often if you're doing something like talking to a mobile app, you want to transform that into something like JSON over HTTP, which is something that all developers can understand, and an increasing number of API gateways do that as well. So let me take a few minutes here and talk about our products. Because so far I've been talking about API management companies who actually do APIs, and what it can do in particular, in a generic way, let me talk about what we have to offer at Google. Google actually offers two products in the world of API management. These are both actually owned by the same team, and I'm responsible for the architecture of both of them. Cloud Endpoints has been a part of Google Cloud for a while. The advantage of Cloud Endpoints is that it is a very small, simple, fast, easy to set up product that gives you the basics of API management. You can verify an API key. You can set a quota. You can do some basic authentication. A lot of companies use Cloud Endpoints in order to build digital experiences in front of workloads that already run on Google Cloud. It takes advantage of many of the API capabilities that are built into Google Cloud, such as the quotas and authentication you're already using if you're a Google Cloud customer. The other product we have is Apigee. Apigee was acquired by Google in late 2016. It's what I've primarily been working on for the last third of my career. And then Apigee does basically everything around API management, not only running as a basic API gateway to do things like authentication, but also there's things like a customizable developer portal, a highly sophisticated and customizable quota mechanism, caching, API monitoring, customizable API analytics, monetization. So if you choose to charge money for an API, you can use Apigee to assign a value to particular API calls and then generate a bill for customers later. And many companies, especially larger enterprises that have a lot of these enterprise complexities to them, find that they need the sophistication of an API management product like Apigee in order to really solve their problems. So the ones who were saying, hey, the foreign exchange department shouldn't be able to call the equity trading department's APIs unless it's approved by a VP. These are the kinds of things that happen in the real world. And they make API management more than just checking an API key in a Redis table, but actually doing some more sophisticated roles-based access controls, these are the kinds of things that a lot of customers use Apigee to do. It's important to mention that Apigee actually runs in multiple modes. One of them is software as a service. Everything runs by Google in the cloud in all of Google's data centers. Other end of the spectrum is on-premises. You can take the whole thing and put it in your own data center and not touch the internet at all. There's a number of companies who have historically had to do that for a whole number of reasons. What we're seeing now is even more and more, people need to be able to run in multi-cloud and in a hybrid environment, and obviously you've heard a lot about that at the conference already today. So Apigee also has a hybrid mode, where the API gateway that actually sits in between the client and server of the API traffic can run in your own data center or your own cloud, or really anywhere you want it to be, while some of the other parts of Apigee, like the management and the analytics, can run as a service run by us. And with that said, Keith is now going to show us how to actually build the APIs that he showed and apply the API management capabilities he showed using Apigee. And sorry, can we go to the demo? There we go.
So we talked about how people consume this, but what did it take to build this service? So we saw that we have this nice weather application with all this data on here. Where's the data coming from, and what's behind this? So let me talk about how I built that using Apigee. So what we have in here is, on the left-hand side there, you see a client application, and it uses API keys to talk to the back-end system. The data is out in BigQuery, and I've got one of the public data sets out there is historical weather, and it has weather going back a few hundred years. And I thought it'd be kind of cool to use that. But the challenges I ran into was I need to authenticate with Google Cloud. And to do that, I have to go get an access token. There's some credentials that need to be exchanged in there, and then I need to send a header to the back end. So that process isn't really important to who's consuming this. On the consumption side of this, I wanted to have API keys so I could identify different applications. I could onboard people pretty quickly. So what we're seeing in here is the left side of this is one set of security. The right side is a different set of security. I also had some other concerns in there. Some of the things that Greg mentioned, some of the things we worry about as we start to share data with new people. And those are things like, how do I build a facade on this back end? So I want to take everything that's back there, no matter when it was written, and make it look clean and new to the consumers of this. So I want to change the request and response that are coming back and forth in there. I wanted to control access to some features. So you can try it out for free and you can get 100 calls. If you're a valued partner, maybe you can come in and you can look at more things if you have a different relationship with us. I wanted to rate limit to protect the back end. So we need to have things in there so that if your application has a loop in there that's uncontrolled, we don't want it to melt the back end for everybody. We want to shut you down. So rate limiting. And I want to impose some quotas for business reasons. I want to have different tiers of service for different people so that I could charge accordingly. And I want to add caching in here. So if somebody makes the same request twice, let's just call it for memory and let's not go all the way to the back end. And reformat the request and the response. So that's what I built. That's what this diagram represents. Let's look at what's behind this. So how did I get there? So the next role for me to play here as the demo person is we're going to look at what does it take to build and manage a service that you want to expose to other people. So I started off with a specification, and I thought about, I know what's in the database, I know how that's formatted, but what do I want to present to the outside world? And for that, I wrote this spec in OpenAPI spec. I did this in Apigee. I've come in here and I've described what the endpoints are. I've described the data formats and things like that. I did that in this left-hand pane. On the right-hand side here, I can see a rendering of what my documentation will look like. So that was the documentation we saw on the website. This is what guided the developers on how to use it. The next thing I did was I took that spec and I turned it into an API proxy in Apigee. And what this does is this is going to control that request and response flow that goes back and forth. What we see in here is there's a URL up here that I'm going to start calling inside of Apigee. And that's going to call this BigQuery API on the back end. If I click over here on Develop, what I'm going to see in here is a graphical depiction of the request and response flow. So what we're seeing is this is the request coming in on the top, right up here, and then we see the response coming back on the bottom. And I'm going to do a few things along the way to manage this request and response flow. For example, I'm going to come in and I'm going to do some rate limiting. And right down here, I'm going to limit them to 10 calls per minute. That's not very fast, but it's something I can demonstrate breaking in a demo. So these different policies are run on the request side. These policies are run on the response side. I have different flows in here that can do different things. I've got a whole set of policies over here that when I click that plus button, they'll get added. Things for traffic management. How do we control just the basic flow going back and forth in there? Things for security. As we start to share with new people, we're always concerned about security. So basic auth to check for usernames and passwords. OAuth, as Greg mentioned, to tie into our identity management system and to identify who's calling. I might want to reformat things. I might want to turn my JSON into XML, XML to JSON if I've got a legacy system on the back end. I may want to extend this with Java callouts, Python callouts, or JavaScript. Or I might want to take advantage of certain things in Google Cloud by using some of these extensions that are specific. So those are all different policies I might add in there. That manages my request and my response flow. And then depending on how this is called, depending on what people put at the end of the URL, I might want to do different things. So if looking for a weather station, I might execute these things. First thing I'm going to do in there is look up an API key that's going to give me access to Google Maps. And I'm going to use that to make a call out and look up that city. So when I type in San Francisco, what I'm really looking for is the latitude and longitude of San Francisco, because that's how the weather stations are in my database. I'm going to look at the response of that. I'm going to grab the latitude and longitude out of that. I'm going to draw a nice little box around that with some code and figure out an area where I want to search for weather stations. That's right there. And then finally, I'm going to build up a BigQuery request, and I'm going to completely replace this request with a whole new body and send that in. And this is completely hidden from my consumer. When I get the response back, I'm going to format the response that comes back to make it look more pleasing and more useful to my developer. So those are all different things that I would do in here to build this up. So I'm going to send in requests, I'm going to see responses. Now, along the way, it's possible, remotely possible, that I made a mistake in my code, and I need to debug this. So I'm going to come in, and I'm going to show what it looks like to debug in here. What I've done is I've turned on trace in here, and this is going to let me look at detailed request response flow in here. So I'll come back over to my weather application, and we'll go back to, let's go back just to 2015. And we'll send a request in there to look up temperature data. And I'll send in a few. And this should shut me down after a bit because I'm being rate limited. So if we come back over to here, we'll see those rolling in, and we can see a detailed response of exactly what happened in there. So here's the request coming in. We can see all the details of what was received by the client. We can see API keys being processed, metadata being loaded to describe who the person is. We see our rate limit in here coming in. You'll notice over here that we see a 429 error. We've applied rate limiting because this person was calling too quickly. So what they're going to see in that case is they're going to see a nice error that says, call rate exceeded, this application is limited to 10 requests per minute. So instead of seeing that big 500, something horrible happened and we don't know what it is, you're going to see a helpful error that's going to help you debug your application. So that's what I did to build this. This was easy for me. I had a back-end system. I made a few calls to it. I figured out what the format was. I thought about how do I want to manage that. I went into Apigee in here. I built an API proxy, and then that's how people were going to call this. So that's a quick example of how you build something in Apigee and exactly what the steps are to do that.
Cool. So in the beginning, we showed you what it might look like to be the consumer of an API. Then we talked a little bit about what it would look like to be an API product manager. And now Keith is showing us what does it look like to actually use Apigee to create the policies in order to make the API work the way that I want it to. Now, if we could go back to the slides for a sec. Something we didn't mention at the beginning, which is that we have this really nifty way, not that way, that way, of having you ask questions. This is an internal Google tool. We're using it next for the first time. It's called Dory, I think after the character in the show. But anyway, and I see that we didn't tell you about this because no one has asked any questions. So this is a great way to ask questions because it lets you type in your question on your mobile device by going to the link that's in the next app for this particular session. And the cool thing about it is that if your neighbors ask tedious questions, you can vote them down. Or if they ask really good questions, you can vote them up. We have only a few more minutes till the session's over, but we will also look when the session is over at what questions are on there, and we'll answer them online if people ask them later. I wanted to mention two more things before we were done. One of them is that we actually do, and this is not a product announcement This is not a product announcement session, but we actually have announced a couple of products today. I mentioned Hybrid earlier for Apigee. Hybrid is a way that you can take the API gateway part of Apigee, which is what Keith was just demoing, and run that anywhere you want, including your own data center, while the rest of Apigee, such as the API analytics, the API product management, and all those kinds of things, including some of the user interface, runs in Google's cloud. This is something our customers have been asking us for a long time, because many, many customers, even if they are completely bought into cloud computing, many of them still have, and may have for a long time to come, stuff that runs in their own data centers or even in other clouds or in private clouds. So Apigee Hybrid gives you a way to do this. That is in beta starting today. We also have something called API security reporting, which is based on some of the analytics that Keith showed. It gives you a little bit more details about how your API traffic is behaving, and it alerts you to things like anomalous API traffic, or even mistakes you might have made, like not configuring TLS properly for your APIs. And finally, some of the policies that Keith showed in that policy editor are actually things that you can extend yourself using a capability called Apigee extensions. There are pre-built extensions for many popular integration technologies like SAP, like many of the Google Cloud APIs, and yes, also many of the Amazon APIs, because many of you use Amazon APIs as well. Apigee extensions is fully GA now. It's been part of the Apigee product for a little while. Last thing I'm going to mention before we go to questions is that we have a whole lot of sessions related to APIs and API management here at Cloud. This session will be videotaped. I can't give you the slides, but it will be on YouTube. It won't be videotaped. It'll be recorded, and it'll be on YouTube. It'll be recorded on 8mm film. But if you want to take a picture of this, a lot of the companies that I mentioned who are actually doing things with APIs, such as AccuWeather and Magalu, are going to be presenting here at Next. Woolies X is the sort of the experimental arm of Woolworths in Australia. They do a lot with APIs and digital technology, as does Kaiser Permanente, Equifax, HP, and Urban Science. So I apologize for many of the sessions being full, but it does seem like if you are patient, you can get in after the first 10 or 15 minutes. So if you're looking to learn more about APIs and API management, then that's a great thing to do.
I've got a few questions on the dory here
Yeah,
that I can take.
We're not going to present them because we don't want to out people's names, but we're going to start. And yeah, let's answer a few of the questions.
So the first question here, how do you manage API versions? So this one comes up almost every time I demo this product. So there's two concepts here. One is basic revisions in the API proxy. So let's say I add caching, but I'm not changing the contract of how this calls back and forth. There is a built-in revisioning system within Apigee to manage the revisions of those API proxies you saw me manipulating. The other thing is versioning. Let's say I break that contract, and I'm going to change the format that comes back completely. There are many ways to do this. Apigee supports all kinds of ways to do this. The most common we're seeing is that people will put v1 or v2 or v3 in the URL as far to the left as possible. And you can deploy this API proxy, you can make a copy of it and deploy a new one and call that version 2, and it can behave differently. You can tie the analytics to that, so you can measure who's on version 1, who's on version 2. Much better than the old way, which is just to turn off one and see who gets angry. So this is better.
And you can also find out who's using that old version of the API. So
yes,
you can maybe even send them an email and say, what's going on?
Or slow them down. We can put in something to slow them down. Give them a little motivation.
You could do that, yeah.
So that's how we would do versioning in here. And you can keep iterating on there. You can measure it and do it formally. So nice feature of that. Let me see what else is in here.
Someone asked about OpenAPI 3. I actually thought that we either did that or were about to do it, so I'll...
It is on the roadmap. I don't know if we can give details, but since they record us and everything, but it's on the roadmap.
Okay, let's see. Why would anyone use cloud endpoints? I really should be able to answer this question by now. One of the advantages of cloud endpoints is it's very simple to get started with. It's also very inexpensive. So it does a few things, but it does them well, and it does them at a very low cost. This can be very important if you have, because what we see, for instance, is companies have very sophisticated API programs with lots of bells and whistles and complex transformations and things, but that may be for low volume things. For a consumer application that's called hundreds of millions or billions of times a day, sometimes you may only need a basic quota and an API key check, and cloud endpoints can do that, and it can do that at a low price point. And we are continuing to develop cloud endpoints. We're going to see actually over the next year or two some more enhancements to it, and over time, cloud endpoints and Apigee will be more will be happy together. Sorry, my app crashed. OK, is there another one you want to take?
I see another one in here asking about GraphQL API support. So this is coming up more and more where people are asking about this. You can send anything that's HTTP back and forth in here. It doesn't necessarily have to be REST. So people use this with SOAP. I've seen people use it with OData and other protocols they're going to add on top of that. We're looking at how to support GraphQL. We don't have anything in there today, but it is something we're definitely looking at. But feel free to use it with GraphQL today. You will find value in that, and we've seen a few patterns on how to support it well with Apigee.
Right. Can all of this be configured via frameworks such as Serverless or ARC.codes? I don't know what ARC.codes is. I don't think Serverless is working with Apigee yet, but we've had people talk about it. Everything in Apigee, however, is done via API.
Yeah.
So what many people have done, so for instance, you showed doing things with a GUI, but what most people do is there's a Maven plugin and an Ant plugin. Well, maybe not no one uses Ant anymore. There's a Jenkins plugin. And a lot of people have built integrations with the APIs to automate the process of defining APIs and pushing them out, and that's an example of how you might do that.
Everything that is in the UI is also supported through a API. So our UI is built on top of those APIs. So you can also use those to automate that, and a lot of people will tie that into their CI/CD.
Yeah. How do I get on board the Apigee hybrid beta? We should have someone in sales.
Come talk to us in the hallway afterwards, right. And we'll give you an answer to that.
Let's see. Can Apigee be used to manage a large inventory of APIs with thousands of internal users versus external users? We've definitely had people do that. We have
a lot of people do that.
Who have hundreds of thousands of consumers of their APIs.
Does Apigee have a circuit breaker for services that slow down? It certainly does. We've got a spike arrest policy in there. That can be inserted in there so that if it's called too frequently, it will shut them down and use the circuit breaker pattern.
Right. Someone asked about using Apigee as a proxy between internal microservices as well as publishing them. There are actually a couple ways to do that. There's a version of the API gateway called the micro gateway, which people sometimes co-locate with lots of services so that they can run it. They can have lots of little API gateways instead of a few big ones. Also, there is integration between Apigee and Istio. So if you're running an Istio service mesh, and if there's no one at this conference running an Istio service mesh, we definitely have them here, you can actually plug Apigee into the Istio mixer so that once Istio is managing your services in the mesh, you can use Apigee for quota, for API key verification, and we're making some progress on OAuth as well. The use case for that is I have a number of services running in Istio, and Istio, by the way, is a part of the new cloud services platform that has a name that I've already forgotten. I'm sorry. But anyway, Apigee, Istio is part of that. If you have Istio and you have services in the Istio mesh, let's imagine you want to turn one or two of those services into APIs, publish them to users outside that service mesh, and use the developer portals, quotas, API keys, and OAuth stuff that we showed you in the demos today. You can do that in Istio right now by integrating Istio with Apigee, whether Apigee is on-premises, hybrid, or in the cloud.
We're running low on time. I would take one more question from the Dory here, and then I think we'll wrap up. So one of you is asking, how do you get free access to Apigee? So go to apigee.com. In the upper right, you'll see a nice free trial. You can click on that button and sign up for a trial account, and you can try out and build things.
So we're going to wrap it up now. The next session starts very soon. We can hang around outside for questions. There's also an Apigee booth in the expo area where there are a lot of people there who are experts who can talk to you. We'd be happy to talk more to you, and we'll get back on a few of the Dory questions as well. So thanks for coming. Enjoy your next sessions. Thank you all.